you ever been to anyone's house and it looks pristine and clean, and then you open up the cupboards and there's just tons of stuff that's hidden? I like to call this the good old skeletons in the closet. And what that means for me is basically holding on to things, including resentment, and not dealing with it, and it just piles up and you just keep on shoving it in there and shoving it in there until one day it just falls and topples all over you. So today I want to talk to you again about resentments. This is resentment part 2. And I wanted you to look at the different ways that it shows up in your mind, body, spirit, spaces, relationships, and how it even creates unsafety in your relationships. And then I want to give you suggestions for each area on how you can let go of those resentments and just really reconnect to yourself, reconnect to your passion, power, and purpose. So let's get started. So first of all, let's look at how does it show up in the mind? Well, I know for me, I've done it, and that's that tape that just keeps on playing, and it looks like ruminating, replaying a past experience, and just really almost like case building and being like, well, they did this to me and da-da-da-da, and then holding that anger, and then it turns into resentment. And with that, it also affects your behaviors because you're thinking, oh, they did this to me, and then you are almost being resentful and retaliating. So instead of coming from a place of love, well, you're just keeping that fire of anger going. The other thing that it does is it really prevents you from acting from a place of consciousness because the mind just takes over and there's an inability to be present. So let's move on to the next one, the body. And with the body, what ends up happening is that with most things and most emotions, when we hold on, there's tension, there's headaches, fatigue, because think if you're tight all the time, you need more energy to hold yourself and to move. Migraines, I used to have lots of those. And then there's this sense of dis-ease, right? A lot of illness comes from resentment, including cancer, and I talk about that in my blog. And that is just this whole held resentment, this held vibration that then just destroys you. And I talked about that in my last video as well. And so another thing that it does is when we're so disconnected from our body because we're thinking and we're angry or resentful, we actually don't notice pain as much. And that's not good because then we're not listening to our body and then we're not able to do proper self-care. So that's definitely something to consider overall, but I would say especially with resentment. The next part is the spirit and the heart. Well, what happens if you're holding on to resentment with people? Well, for one, you lose connection to your intuition, your inner knowing, your inner guidance, right? You lose connection with living from a place from compassion. How can you do that if you just want to get back at someone? You can't act from a place of love. And then you lose sight of your soul purpose, right? Because it's all connected. The heart is acting from a place of love. Your spirit is who you are and coming into this world. And then it's, how do those work together if you're constantly thinking that you want to get back at someone? You can't. It's not possible. So the other thing that then happens is in your relationships, well, what happens to the space? Probably say this in every video that I do, things pile up because a resentment is an unresolved issue. And if you're not dealing with it, it's affecting your behavior. And either A, you're doing more than your share because you're resentful because the other person doesn't do it the way you want it done, or B, you're avoiding because the other person is judging you and you're like, forget it, I'm just not going to do it. So then things pile up. And again, this is seen in general, especially with resentment though in relationships, I would say. And so then another thing to consider is looking at my perfectionist video, because if you're that person who's always criticizing and expecting things to be perfect, those standards cannot be held, and that creates a lot of rigidity in a relationship. And then the other person is just going to avoid doing things, or they're going to become that super people pleaser, and it creates this horrible imbalance, and people aren't acting from a place of consciousness and from their true selves. So that's a big one, to really sit back and go, okay, how am I being rigid? How am I being controlling? How am I being a perfectionist? Or the flip side, how am I avoiding because I don't want that criticism? And so in a relationship, it's really important to let go of doing things right and imposing that on someone. Another thing that happens is that, you create this dynamic where you don't feel safe. And that's the next one. Relationships and spaces kind of go together. And when you don't respect someone's opinion, when you don't listen to their side of the story, when you don't try to understand, this creates unsafety. And that looks like blaming, shaming, judging, avoiding. There's no shared understanding. And if I don't feel safe, I'm not going to be fully honest. I'm not going to be fully transparent. I'm not going to be vulnerable. In a healthy relationship, you need to be in a place where you can expose your soft spots and expose past things that have happened to you and why a certain situation's affecting you, and then be able to talk to the other person about it and go, oh, okay, I didn't realize that, okay, and just by doing that, you're releasing the past. And then you're able to live more in the present and come to a shared agreement. But you can't do that if someone's being passive aggressive, avoidant, or even people pleasing, as I mentioned before. So now what? Well, let's look at what you can do. So let's jump back to the mind. I really like to start with values when I work with people. That's my first step. What are your values and intentions? What's important to you? And remember, these change, because as you change, your points of view change, and what's important to you changes. So keep that in mind. However, it's a great anchor place to start, where you go, okay, what's important to me right now? What is it that I want to create? And what am I doing right now? What resentments am I holding on to that's preventing me to stay connected to my values? And then look at, well, what stories am I telling myself? What rumination am I doing about the past that's preventing me? So then that changing that narrative is part of the process of letting go of that resentment in the mind. And then remembering, well, what do you want to replace it with? If I'm saying, oh, people take advantage of me, and then I'm wearing those glasses of everyone takes advantage of me, instead of staying connected to my values, standing up for myself, and saying, you know what, people are very giving, and I can choose when I give, and I'm open to receive. And then things start shifting, because then you start noticing what you're thinking. It's magic. Then when we're looking at the body, it's really important to have strategies that are, let's say, I don't want to say maintenance, but for strengthening. And then to have strategies for when you are stressed or outside of that nervous system window that I talk a lot about. So having a regular movement practice, because then you release those emotions, right, in a healthy way. Doing practices that help you get back into ventral vagal. And then doing other practices that help you release the emotions, right? And so my favorite one right now is the emotion code. You can do different forms of energy healing. You can even do like a ritual where you're like, I release the resentment of the situation, and do like a dance, whatever works for you. Because for me, I think it's the power of intention and the power of the mind and just being very in tune with energy. So it doesn't really matter what the technique is, as long as you're really putting that effort and energy into it and you're noticing a difference. So the other one, moving on to energy, is the spirit. And with the spirit, again, we want to look at what are your practices to stay connected to your passion, to stay connected to your power and your life purpose. Because if you're constantly ruminating about someone else, most likely you're forgetting about why you're here, and you're not putting your energy into the things that you want to create because you're so busy trying to prove someone else wrong or trying to get back at them. That doesn't help anybody. And so the other thing that that does is it stops you from being empathetic and compassionate. And so it's really important to also cultivate that compassion. Maybe it could be through a meditation practice. Maybe again, it's through journaling. I love the journaling. Or talking to someone who's really good at it, a friend, or reading a book or doing a workshop, whatever works for you to kind of really strengthen that ability to have compassion and empathy for others and yourself, of course. And the other piece with all this is, well, what does it mean for you to be connected to your spirit? What does it mean for you to be connected to your heart? So it's also this process of learning about yourself and what things mean for you. Okay? And now we're going to jump to the spaces. So yes, declutter, obviously. Get rid of those skeletons in the closet. And when you do, the stories will go with it. And as you're letting them go, you process that story. Okay, that's what happened. That's my meaning that I'm giving this object. I'm ready to let you go, and I'm ready to replace it with something different. The other part of it is also the behaviors and actions and beliefs. So either step up or step back. So either step up if you've been avoiding doing things around your home, or step back if you're that one that's pushing for that perfectionism and rigidity that things have to be a certain way. So keep in mind that it's not just about letting go of the belongings, it's letting go of the stories that came with those belongings, the past resentments that came with it, as well as changing your behaviors so that you don't create that dynamic and that clutter in the closet. And when we're looking now at relationships, it's important to get support. Someone told me one time that a scale can't weigh itself. I love that phrase because you can't do therapy on yourself. So whether you see a therapist, a counselor, a healer, a trauma coach, whoever it is, seek out professional help to help you deal with these resentments. It makes the process so much quicker, and it's part of relational healing. Doing on your own is a little more tricky and less effective. And then by doing that, it really helps you look at, well, what new dynamics do I want to create in my relationships? How do I want to communicate differently? There's many different strategies around effective communication, loving communication, like nonviolent communication is one strategy. And it's also just tuning into your heart and speaking from that place. And then it just flows out of you, and it's not something that you have to script or practice. So the more you get in alignment with all these different aspects of your life, things just get easier. And that also comes with the safety aspect. So this requires a lot of kind of, let's say, reflection. You want to start connecting with the mind, body, and spirit and go, okay, well, when do I feel unsafe? What does that look like in my mind? What does that look like in my body? What does that look like in my spirit, right? And then what do I do? How can I pay attention to see when someone else doesn't feel safe because of my behavior? What am I like? So it's a two-way street, because you want to notice when you're feeling unsafe, but also when you're creating an unsafe situation for someone. And then from there, how can you start creating that sense of safety? If you get triggered easily, my go-to and first foundational piece is strengthening your nervous system and processing your trauma. So I have videos on that, check that out. And then the other piece is, again, that communication. How are you going to find ways to communicate so you're not blaming, shaming, judging, avoiding, being passive aggressive and resentful? How can you process the information first so that you're not lashing out and creating more resentments, okay? And this is where I also wanted to do a little bonus. Those are the different aspects that you can change. Now I want to look at two other aspects of letting go of resentment. One is the trigger and the flashback. Trigger is turning on that light switch, it's on. The flashback is how long is that light going to stay on? So if you're constantly getting triggered and your body's constantly in the flashback, you're constantly living in the past. So how can you start to deal with those triggers and flashbacks so that you're not lashing out on people or retreating, right? Depending on what your F type is, if you flee and fight, or if fawn and freeze, like depending on what it is. And it changes depending on the trigger, it changes depending on the person that you're with. How can you start looking at that and noticing and going, oh my goodness, I'm reacting here. I'm in a flashback. My body feels like it's in the past. Maybe I don't have the memory of it. And then you'll start noticing, whoa, I'm behaving in a way that actually doesn't make sense for what's happening now in the present moment. And that is a very, 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 very powerful process. If you can start getting support with that, and if there's at least one person in your life that you can be vulnerable with, to start being able to shift and say, hey, I'm having a flashback right now. And then change gears, deal with the flashback, and then get back to that moment and dealing with the situation. So Pete Walker has a great 13-step process for dealing with a flashback, and I'll be sure to include that in the comments section. The last little bonus that I want to give you is that how do you deal with anger in a healthy way? And that looks like a few different things. And remember, anger is an emotion, and emotion is energy. It's a flash emotion. So if you release it quickly, then it makes it easier to process it. So things like squeezing, pushing, punching a pillow, shaking, these things allow you to release it quickly and not put any harm to anyone else, as well as yourself. And then looking at, well, when does this happen? Anger is usually coming up if a boundary has been crossed or if you need to take action. So allow that red flag to come up, but don't hold on to it so that it builds into resentment. From there, once you release it more in like an energetic way, you can then start processing what happened, right? Are you triggered? Are you having a flashback? Is there a situation that needs to be addressed? And how are you going to deal with that? Is there someone that you can talk to? Can you do some journaling? That way you can get back to your center and figure out, well, what is it that I'm feeling? What is it that I really need? And how can I make that request to someone? How can I set boundaries around myself and others so that that doesn't keep on happening, that pattern doesn't continue? And the other piece with that is learning to pause, which is so hard, and just being like, I'm really angry, I need to pause, so that you can take that step away, process, and then come back and be able to speak about things in a way that's more loving and connected to compassion and empathy than this like rage and resentment. And then the last thing I want to mention is meds. If you have a daily practice of meditation, exercise, diet, sleep, social, and spiritual, if all those needs are being taken care of, you're less likely to be reactionary and angry. Because if you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, you're likely to lash out, and then that creates resentment in your relationships if you're not resolving it, and then those skeletons in the closet continue to build up. So to recap, how does resentment look? Well, in the mind, it's that ruminating thinking. In the body, it's that tension, those headaches, the fatigue. In the spirit, you're totally disconnected from your intuition, your inner knowing, and compassion in your heart. And then in your spaces, it's just things are not getting done, or you're doing too much because you're resentful. And then looking at your relationships, it creates a lot of unsafety and unhealthy passive-aggressive dynamics for one. So remember, getting into these daily practices to help you release the resentment, but also to help you maintain alignment with yourself. You're going to act more from a place of compassion, power, and purpose, and you won't be acting from the past, you'll be acting from the present, and that's where the power is. So remember to like and subscribe so you can watch more videos like this, and stay tuned for my memberships where you can take online courses and do things at your own pace, as well as tune into bi-weekly live sessions.